Welcome to Uncaged, a show that celebrates thought leadership from today's top business leaders. The program provides a voice to amazing executives from around the globe who are shaping the world of business today and mapping the path to the commerce of tomorrow. Today, we're speaking with Mandali Khalesi. How are you? It's great to have you on the show.
Hi, doing great. Thanks for having me.
But before we get into all the exciting stuff that you're doing in the autonomous vehicle space today, it'd be great to hear a little bit about yourself and your career so far.
Yeah, thanks again for having me on the show. It's great to be able to speak with you. Yeah, I'm originally from the UK. I grew up in France, which is maybe an oxymoron. So I call Paris my home. I have a technical background, so I started in enterprise IT, and then that moved into mobile in the early 2000s. And then, as you know, a vehicle now is a smartphone on wheels, or so they say, or so they plan. So I moved from mobile to automotive over the last basically 10, 15 years. And as you know, the revolution of the mobile phone has really helped the vehicle become much closer to consumer needs, right? What people need, because for many people nowadays, the mobile is the main touch point to a lot of the services, and the vehicle should not be connected, but it should just be an extension of your experience that is often now mediated through the mobile. So yeah, that's been my background. So as you mentioned, now I work in autonomy at Fortuna.
Yeah, and I mean, what a great place to find yourself at a time when everyone's thinking about either electric cars or hydrogen powered cars or vehicles that actually don't have any form of a driver. And there's so much innovation happening in the automotive space. So Mandali, tell me a little bit more about where you guys are today and what you're focused on.
Yeah, I think the focal point really is, are we able to support these big social and socioeconomic changes that are ongoing, right? I think one of the main things we have is climate change. So that's kind of one big trend, right? Another big trend is mega cities and migration, and we're seeing that happen kind of everywhere. Population depopulating the rural areas, and mega cities becoming larger and more densely populated. And so there's a economic dichotomy, if you will, with rural areas kind of losing the economic potential to run services for public services, mobility services, etc. And they're increasingly growing older, right? And so with age comes less responsiveness when you're driving a car, leads to less opportunities to move freely, right? And so it's decreasing quality of life. And this is not something that's happening only in Japan, it's happening globally. So that's really the kind of background against what we're doing, and we're basically seeing solutions through technology. Is technology something we can do to help improve and or maintain people's quality of life? So autonomy is one of them, right? So in many cases, when in Japan at least, over a certain age, the government is actually recommending people to hand back their driver's licenses. Because it might be a danger to themselves, to others. At the same time, people need to get ferried to supermarket, see their friends, see their family, go to the clinic, go to the public services, and maybe they can't afford getting a cab every time because pensions are every year going down. So is there a solution to help them? Is there a solution to help us get more time back on our commute? Increasingly, cities are congested. You spend so much time in the commute. Why bother in stop and start traffic? Why not just press a button and do something else with that time? So I think these are the things that we're kind of really focusing on, using software to just see if we can improve people's lives through these big...
I love that, Mandali, and I know that you mentioned obviously things like coming up with a way to have a more sustainable economy, dealing with global warming and climate control. Let's go through those kind of broader trends a little bit more and put it into context with the work that you're focused on these days. So let's take a topic like global warming. How does that play into what you and the team are focused on?
So I think you're seeing a diversification now with the EV revolution, so electric vehicle revolution that's going on, and I think we all have a part to play to move away from fossil fuels.
Hmm.
And that's something that I personally think is something that's very exciting. I think electric vehicles is something that can benefit climate change. It can bring that under control. Hopefully, we talk about 1.5 Celsius, right? We're still far from that. And so, but then on the converse, I think we have to think about electric vehicles as the entire supply chain of where does the electricity come from, right? If it comes from fossil fuels in the first place, it defeats the purpose. So I think, whether it's hydrogen, fuel cells, EV, hybrid, how can we decarbonize the energy
Hmm.
supply chain? I think is what we're seeing now, and if transportation and EVs can support that, then and all the better. I think one of the challenges you're seeing now with the recent war in Ukraine and the price of fuel going up, etc., is that people are turning on the nuclear power stations again,
Hmm.
and we're having to move back to that portion of the grid being more supported by fossil fuels. So I think there's a kind of conflict right now in the energy equation whereby there just prices are just forcing people back into maybe what's not an ideal scenario. But I think
Hmm.
overall, in the medium to longer trend, I think we need to bring, climate change is on us, right? I think we
That,
know that every day.
I think that's such a great way to frame that up, because I have seen that discussed, but perhaps not in the way that you just described it, which is certainly we find ourselves in a moment of acute need, right? With the energy challenges. And yet there's also a longer will, a longer desire, and a longer understanding that we all have to come up with like a sustainable model. And trying to figure out how to balance those two things has been challenging, to say the least.
Yeah, I think we're right now at a time which is it's very difficult. I think so. Regulators, I think, around the world are very much driven to see how we can decarbonize, how we can move away from fossil fuels. On the
Mhm.
other hand, we have these prices for fuel we have today. We have these supply chain issues. On the other hand, renewable energy is also not like plug and play, right? You
Yeah.
can't just switch off all the fossil fuel and switch on all the wind power and everything fine, right? It's still only a proportion of what you need to keep the lights on. So I
Mhm.
think there's a marketing view which is or I guess a more social aspirational view which is we need to decarbonize, we need to bring climate change under control. But on the other hand, it's like infrastructure takes a long time to put in place. Those building it need to amortize their costs over someone actually paying for the service that runs on them. It's
Yeah.
not a free lunch, right? And so, even though, for example, for EVs, some countries are phasing out, regular what we call internal combustion engine, and potentially hybrids, and switch them out for EVs. But then, do you have that power grid to support everyone suddenly switching to plugging in their car into their house or into a charging station? I found, if climate change is really a global issue that we're trying to achieve, and I kind of wrote this on my blog a couple of months back. I was looking at sub-Saharan Africa and how self-driving and EVs could potentially benefit them. And the number one issue I found was electrification. Like there is
Mm.
simply not a strong enough power grid to just have everyone just overnight switch to EV.
Yeah.
And infrastructure is not free, and implementing it and allowing people to use that also needs to make sense from a business perspective. So I think it's just an extreme example, but I think it's the same thing that everyone is struggling with, right? In certain areas like California, they have had a policy there in place for. I was surprised. I found this out just a couple of days ago. They set up the zero emission vehicle policy
Mhm.
in 1990. That's like over 30 years ago, and now it's like California is a great place for yeah, they made that decision 30 years ago, and they're
Yeah.
still kind of building up to it. So I think we need a kind of reality check that either we're going to do something radically different and
Mm.
literally like stop investing in a whole bunch of stuff tomorrow and focus on electrification and building that infrastructure in the next 5 to 10 years, or it's going to be a more gradual process where we're
Right.
going to be more pragmatic about a number of different sources and do that gradually. So, there's no silver bullet. That's the
Yeah, no, I hear you. I love the way that you've outlined it, and certainly you've laid out the key issues. And I want to jump back to the topic that you mentioned up front, which is the work that you are doing to build these vehicles that really kind of offer mobility, everyone more mobility as they age. And we have the situation, sad news about the Queen passing, but certainly she lived for 96 years. So it gives you a sense that people are living longer these days and trying to figure out ways to give them more autonomy as they get older. Tell me where we are in terms of rolling some of these exciting things that I know you and your team are working on out to the broader public.
Yeah, I think the promise of fully autonomous is has gone away, right? I think we're having regulators being a little bit more what's the word? A little bit more strict about making sure that reality meets the needs of users, and that reality needs the reality of what's in the product. I think the difficulty is there's a lot of excitement around autonomy, but as we now know, it's very, very difficult to do, full autonomy, because it takes people, people are just such good drivers, actually. Even if you think you're a lousy driver, you are and maybe a decade ahead of some AI that's available in the cutting edge research teams across the world. And I think it's really a combination of understanding, dynamics of, different actors on the world. So it's actually really an inherent understanding of social interactions between agents, which we call, in software we call agents on the road, because you have an understanding of how you interact with people, right? And so that's something that machines don't have. When you switch them on, they're like, okay, I see something in front of me, like, what is that? And that's literally where we are today. So thanks to libraries that give them a bunch of data sets that say, okay, this is a person, this is a bicycle, this is a camel, this is a cow,
Yeah,
that's okay, but then they still need to relate to it. So how
yeah,
do they infer that? Oftentimes in a lot of research papers, you get what they call GPUs, graphical processing units. Very
yeah,
expensive, very power hungry, very processing hungry, and you can't get them in most vehicles that most of the people will buy, right?
right.
So in a sense, what you're saying is you have a vehicle that doesn't know where it is, that doesn't have the processing power to infer any relationships, and it doesn't know how people interact. So how on earth are you going to have a safe drive with people doing something else in the car? So I think that's really the problem that we're facing, is that the technology is there at the very high end,
Hmm.
but there is no way you can amortize that over a decent period for a regular mass market customer just to buy at an affordable price. And now, the cost of living is going up, right? Which means
Right.
what's left in your wallet is going down. And so again, we have these price pressures to bring down that technology to a price point where anyone can afford, and that's really tough. So the question really is, where's that juncture between cool innovation and reliability at a really
Hmm.
low cost that everyone can benefit, and that's when you can impact society, right? And it's
Yeah,
not
absolutely. I
just
mean, I think that the GPU challenge has been at the center of several decades of kind of growth and pauses in terms of innovation in this area. And so I do think it's an interesting moment that we're at, but to scale it, we are certainly going to have to crack that nut in terms of how we can lower the costs and how we can manage data more efficiently. And perhaps it's going to be that next layer of applying maybe machine learning in some form or fashion to make those more human-like inferences.
Mhm.
I don't
Yeah,
know.
you talk about data. I think that's another challenge we have with data, because now we have data that's not able to cross borders as
Hmm.
easily as it used to be, for good or bad, and bad, right? Because in some ways, data could be accessed anywhere, anytime, with very little limitations, which introduces privacy issues, right? Now we've gone the other way. It's like now we want to make sure the data is private, that we have control over it, ability to be forgotten, all that. But now we have basically a decoupling of of regulations, right? So different jurisdictions, whether it's Europe, Japan, US, China, all of these had different ways of manipulating data, and each of those have to be taken care of separately. So it introduces a lot of cost, it introduces a lot of complexity, and if you put your foot, in the wrong direction from a regulatory perspective, that means that you're not compliant. So
Yeah.
that means you can't roll out your product. That means you can't drive that innovation. So I think there's a lot of complexity now that's actually involved in the processing and ensuring data not only is private, but kind of meets the regulations
Hmm.
in different jurisdictions. So it's not, so a solution built in Japan might not necessarily translate to another jurisdiction. You might need to completely rewrite it, which creates silos, right? And
Yeah.
silos, drives down, innovation. So it's this, how do you balance, a global solution like a big company would want to, if you want to scale, you need to have like one solution that drives
Yeah.
everything versus customizing for each and every use case, each and every jurisdiction.
Well, let me
And
ask you about that a little bit more, because I think that certainly over the last couple of years, you are at this stage now where you're coming out of the pandemic. How did this pandemic shape the business and the way you worked? I mean, certainly some of the things we're discussing now, like silos, access to various technologies, I can imagine may have presented some challenges, but perhaps there has been some innovation that's come from this as well.
yeah, I think my personal experience with COVID was, we couldn't get into the office and our teams were distributed. So it was, I think on one hand, it forces people to communicate more
Mm-hmm.
and more regularly, because what you may consider through tacit communication or unspoken communication when you're sitting in an office together or in a room together, there's actually quite a lot of information flowing there, and you're just not aware of it. But everyone kind of gets it, right? Kind of you're kind of through osmosis.
Mm-hmm.
When you're on a call, on a video call, it's you lose most of that. So I
Yeah.
think being more explicit with communication, I think that's affected a lot of cultures that have a high predominance of nonverbal communication,
Mm.
and kind of implicit communication. They've been forced to become more explicit in the formulation of what they need by when, right? And so many cultures don't necessarily, that's not inherent to them. So I
Mm-hmm.
think Japanese culture is one of those, right? It's very much reliant on nonverbal communication, team consensus, team building, while you're in a physical space. And so that's not been obvious for them to make that transition. Being more communicative, I think, on regular basis. So before I do an all hands meeting every month, right, and then kind of lay out what's going on, what's happened, and what's coming up. But then I switched to weekly, right, and
Mm.
I made it much shorter because attention spans are shorter. But if you don't do weekly, then you lose touch because everyone's at home. That's your only touch point with your superior or your or management, right? And so management tends to get decoupled much easier than peers who are working together anyway. So I think be more communicative more often, be more explicit on expectations, and then managing work-life balance across time zones has been a bummer, right? It's really difficult to that there is no you make yourself available 24/7. That's also not very good. You try to block time off. It benefits one group, it doesn't benefit another. Rotating, there's not a good solution. And so, but I think we're all in this together was one of the things that I found is important. It's just
Yeah.
it's not going to benefit everyone all the time, but we're all just going to get a hit like once every couple of weeks. So just talk to your family, just get somehow them to agree to it, and then we'll just work it out together. And I think being kind of open and honest about that, I think helped.
Yeah.
When a lot of people were anxious, a lot of people weren't seeing each other, and other people didn't know, couldn't see the end of the tunnel. And so I think it was that's how we. I think that's how I changed the way I work with my team.
Yeah. No, I love that perspective. I mean, we now find ourselves finally, knock on wood, I should say, probably, finding our way out of some of these challenges slowly but surely. And Mandali, when you look forward with your team, what does the near future look like for you? What are the priorities on the docket?
Yeah, it just comes back to really what I was mentioning in the early part of our conversation. I think it's really, what are the large social trends that aren't going away and that are driving change across the planet? Like, how can we support those? How can we make people's life better, quality of life better? So,
Mhm.
if it's around climate, how can we help decarbonize? How can we help diversify how people move around, the energy sources that they have, and the benefit they can have with that? That's one.
Mhm.
And then, how can we do better with the time we have in the car or in that mobility that we have? So, increasing the amount of autonomy while making it reliable. And so that's really my touch point. Like really, what I go back to, like wake up every morning, like okay, what are we trying to do? Okay, this is what we're trying to affect. How are we going to do it? Okay, it needs to be cool, innovative, and reliable. So, how do we make that happen? Because all these three things are completely in conflict with each other, right? And so
Yeah,
that kind of
absolutely.
creates an anchor, right? That you can then kind of work towards on a particular angle, a particular product, and I think it keeps you focused because there's a lot of distraction and there's a lot of challenges on the road. But it just helps you stay focused on why you wake up in the morning, which I think
Yeah.
is
Well, I mean, certainly the beauty of what you're doing, Mandali, is that you're working on literally the most important challenges that we are all facing as human beings and humankind. And so, what an exciting place to be working on them right now. We've been speaking with Mandali Khalesi, and what we've been speaking today about are those challenges that society faces, whether it be climate change, whether it be providing the elderly with more mobility in their lives and more flexibility, ways that we can bring data together, ways that we can actually think about smarter solutions in a more scalable and efficient manner. These are key elements that will be shaping and structuring society as we go forward. And Mandali will have all of the answers for all of us by next Tuesday.
yeah. Let me get back to you on that one.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us. If somebody
Thank you.
wanted to learn more about what you're working on, where should they find you?
Yeah, well, you can find me on LinkedIn and Twitter. I try to I try to spend a couple of hours a week looking at what are the key technology trends and key like technology innovations that could support the work. So in some cases it might be research, in other cases it might be more business driven discussions. But I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Twitter. So if you look for me there, Mandali Khalesi, you can probably find me.
Excellent. Well, Mandali, thank you so much for being on Uncaged Day, and we look forward to having you back.
Yeah,
Cheers.
thank you so much for having me on the show. Thanks so much.